and thank you for being here this morning. My name is Sharice Campbell, and I'm the Chief of Community Engagement and Innovative Partnerships here in DeKalb County Schools. Today, we're going to share round 2 scenarios and answer your questions. As enrollment declines and resources stretch, we have a responsibility to look ahead and plan in ways that support long-term sustainability and strong opportunities for every student. The student assignment project with your feedback is designed to ensure our schools are aligned with enrollment trends and the evolving needs of our community. As we've continued to say throughout this process, no final decisions have been made. We are listening, refining, and shaping together. The scenarios you're about to see are based on the feedback received during round 1 and our building goals. Your input matters, and that's exactly why we're hosting these sessions this week. Your feedback in our feedback survey would help shape the next round of scenarios. This round of scenario feedback will close on April 12th. We have partnered with HBM Group for the SAP process. So now I'm going to turn it over to Scott Leopold to review the round 2 scenario details. Actually, Scott's going to review the website. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Let me share my screen real quick. So I'm going to start from the main website. So if you just go to the DeKalb Schools main website, and then you go down to Student Assignment Project. There's a button for that. And this kind of has all the resources laid out throughout the, that we've gone through throughout the entire SAP process. You can click on round 2 scenarios up here, and this will give you all the information kind of broken down. We've grouped things into kind of 5 super clusters here, and you can kind of drill down and see all of the materials for each of these groups. It details which clusters are included here. I think another important thing, you can also go and review round 1 scenarios. And then if you kind of scroll all the way to the bottom, I think this is another big important piece. You can review the scenario 1 FAQs. And that's very helpful to kind of, keep in mind as you're going through and reviewing what you see in round 2. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy to, kind of take us through the process and the changes that we've had between 1 and 2.
Okay, thank you, Scott. So am I coming up on camera there?
Yep.
Okay, so thanks again for joining us this morning. I'm going to take you through some round 2 scenarios now. What I also kind of want to point out here is that, we've had, several meetings this week, including, I think we've met with 9 different clusters this week and intend to go out again on Monday night at McNair High School to talk about those cluster areas. And so we're, again, pretty deep into a lot of conversations this week, a lot of feedback about, about these scenarios. And so as we even walk through these today, we continue to learn and we continue to go deeper in the conversations in each community. So I want you to know that we very much appreciate that, the collaboration that's happened this week and the idea that we can continue to improve on these scenarios and continue to move forward and get a little deeper as we go into the next round. And so I will share with my screen and go into presentation mode here. I want to make sure everybody can see that. Are we good there? I just want to make sure somebody give me a heads up there that we're good. So I think that when we look back on the feedback from the first round, a lot of questions that arise from this, and then as a result, what do you do with the feedback that you get? And we heard a lot about enrollment, utilization, and capacity, and understanding that for a little over a year, the SAP committee has gone through layers and layers of data, and understanding how enrollment projections are completed, what does a capacity of a building really mean, and why how do you come to that number, and then what utilization means. And I've continued to say through this process, as you go through a process like this, and your utilization at a certain school is certainly one factor that we talk about. But we really talk a lot about enrollment, and we talk about the size of schools and ensuring that we have schools that are right size, that aren't too big but aren't too small, that allow us to have the right resources in the building. And when we talk about resources, we're not just talking about special programs. We're talking about foundational core programs. We're talking then about all the supportive programs. We're talking about the supportive services in buildings to be able to serve all children and the needs of all children. And so when utilization at one building, may not be good, but in a building, but the enrollment will work. But when you start to kind of domino the utilization across the district and you see, 20,000 additional seats out there, and that number is anticipated to increase the number of empty seats, we start to understand that we spread our resources and will continue to spread our resources so we can't get the depth of program that we need. And so this isn't the case at everywhere. Some cases we're talking about school size. And what we continue to learn in as we go deeper into this is that there's so many unique situations across the district that you have to deal with, that as you overlay what is attempted to be an equitable application of standard, like, we want schools not less than 600, even though the district standard for 10 years has been a 900 student station elementary construction. But we're trying to get it to a number that we get, a minimum of 4 teachers per grade level. We feel like that's a constructive team at every grade level, at the elementary grade level. So school size becomes an issue, and then utilization becomes the issue, continued decline in enrollment, and then how do we balance good program delivery across the district? One of the things we introduced was grade bands, and when we talked to the board early in the process, and we talked to internal staff, and then even talking to some community members about how can grade configuration, are there possibilities that grade configuration can help us balance some of this? And certainly it can. I think that grade configuration isn't the solve all. Shifting students around 20,000 seats still leaves 20,000 seats empty. But where can we look at grade configuration scenarios that benefit students? And so we get a lot of questions about what does research show? And research is research can be vague in this category because there are a lot of different research that will support different grade configurations. What we do know is that K-8 is a prominent grade configuration out there that can be effective, and we see effective results in more urban areas where the K-8 or the pre-K-8 school allows for less transitions, builds a longer cohort of students, and staying in one school for longer builds a culture. And then we also see different grade configurations. We've introduced like a 612, and the intent of the 612 was is it possible at our high school facilities that are underutilized, if we want to keep our high school clusters open and intact, can we put a middle school high school concept on a site? And so the intent of the 612 was to operate a middle school and a high school on the same site to better utilize facilities, and then cascade elementary schools into those middle schools, allowing us flexibility of capacity in the future. We heard a lot of conversation around school community and support, and what that means to how communities help support buildings, and what does it mean if a school does close, what happens to a site, and repurposing and reuse, and how do we identify those uses so our buildings just don't become blight and we take away a presence in the neighborhood that's been there. And certainly we look at things like, I think one thing we look a lot at when we talk about this neighborhood and community is, we want to look at live attend analysis. We want to see, are there high rates of students that live in a boundary and attend outside the boundary? And if that's the case, why is that the case? Or are there cases where students are attending into a boundary? And so we look at those to kind of determine the level of how we can kind of do some analysis on why students may or may not be staying in a boundary. And then the facility expansion and constraints that we have, I know there are unique sites across the district, as you can imagine, in a district this large, that kind of don't really fit in the category of utilization or small school size and things like that, but the site offers challenges that we're going to have to address and look at. And so I think as we step back into this third kind of iteration, as we do a deeper dive and responding to communities to say, hey, can we pause for a second to see really what the implications of site analysis can mean when it comes to either new construction or additions onto facilities. And so, stepping back from those to really respond to the community ask is what the intent is. And then really asking for some more detail. And the trick of this detail is that, we hear a lot of questions around what are the transportation impacts, what are the staffing impacts, and what are those? Well, in these scenarios right now, transportation, obviously, transportation would have, hundreds of thousands of different kind of scenarios based on the scenarios that get presented. And so as you start to narrow down, you can start to see the impact of transportation. But the fact of the matter is, and I just had a conversation with the student government president yesterday at Lithonia High School, and he talked about school buses that show up at 8:20 instead of 8:10. And it's not that the school bus drivers aren't doing their job, and they're doing it well, but when you're going across so many facilities and stretching those resources, you can see that there's a big impact on transportation because we have to get kids to so many different buildings when there's so many empty seats still out there. And so how do you make transportation more efficient where ride times aren't longer and we use our buses more efficiently, and that we can hire the right amount of staff to bus our kids and those kind of things. And I think those are the things we're hearing out there that are really important, because in that student's perspective, his exact comment was like, if it's hard for those students to be engaged when we can't get here on time, but he understands how the resources get stretched too. And so it's a really good conversation. And that's what those are the kind of conversations when we're talking out there that we're hearing. And so the more detail into that, and then the balance last on that on more detail is that, you can, what we're trying to do is do planning in public, and it's messy sometimes, and we get that. But we also know that, you come out and you start to put out scenarios that say, this and this and this, and this is the transportation impact, and this is the boundary impact. And then the conversation immediately goes to, well, you've already made up your mind. You're not going to change it anyway. And it doesn't leave any room for pliability in this process. And so it's intended to kind of build toward the idea that we can do deeper analysis as we break down further into what can be really good scenarios. And then the question that arises, and we heard this a lot this week, is that, well, we provided this input and we still didn't see a change. Well, it doesn't mean that input got ignored. What it means is that as you look at it, we're still in a situation where we have 20,000 empty seats. It's not a matter of just shifting students around and hiding those 20,000 seats. There is still a need to look at the infrastructure of this district and make it more efficient to support learning. But so we take the data that, even though you might not see a change, it can help us shape kind of, if this is going to happen, what are the things that the community sees as challenges or they're concerned about in a change like this? And so we can be more proactive in the idea, if an implementation were to happen, that we see the concerns and we're proactive in the concerns. And when we're starting to talk about implementation plans, we can address those up front and be proactive with them and not reactive to them. And then finally, the proposed capital improvement projects, as we look towards eSPLOST, how do we use the eSPLOST to make investments in communities most impacted by this? The data leads us to really 11 major projects that could be identified in the next SPLOST. Many of those are south of Route 78 because that's where the data leads us. The needs are there for facilities improvements. And then a big question around phasing and consideration was near term, medium term, and long term, and what does that mean? And the near term really is, can we make moves that don't require a whole lot of capital investment, that the transportation can work and the staffing can work, and can we, at our best, move the majority of a cohort of a school together? Those would be near term, and not that we wouldn't make improvements to facilities that students are walking into, but we can make them more immediately because the buildings are ready for more students. Medium term would be things like what are coming up in the next eSPLOST that allow us to make good these major project and capital investments, that when that school is ready to receive students based on the funding ability to improve the school building, that we can make that move. And long-term considerations are really looking out there in the future to say, as we see trends in enrollment and we see, where buildings are going from an adequacy and condition standpoint, what things can we anticipate in that long term? And I think these near term and these medium term and long terms have brought some anxiety to the process, because there is still some unknowns, but there still has to be kind of an identified longer term vision that is going to have to be, and I keep using the word pliable because I think that's the best word for it, that you have to be able to shift over the time, and because planning is continuous, and enrollment shift, and birth rates could shift, and housing could do more startups, and as far as resale and generating kids again, and so we have to remain flexible for those medium and long term considerations, but we also have to identify where they're at and be prepared for them. But I think that really focusing on those near term implications, those near and medium term implications in this next round will be the primary focus to make sure that we are doing more laser focus in those communities that could be most impacted by this. So let's go into some specific changes in here. Again, I think a lot of conversation around the Dunwoody, Champlain, Cross Keys clusters. Obviously we have very soon a new middle high school opening at Sequoia, which is going to have a huge impact on this area. And so in this area, we're still balancing this idea that our process has talked about facilities, then programs and boundaries, where in the shadow of this is that we have a boundary kind of scenario that has to come up that will impact this area. And so, a lot of great constructive feedback from the Vanderland community and concern about that, why would that school, can it be used as an annex for the school? We know Dunwoody is an overutilized high school. And part of the effort of trying to preserve clusters as much as we can. What can we do to kind of expand capacity and keep the cluster intact? But we understand the Vanderland community has a huge concern around this and displacing the students and things like that. And so there's some conversation to continue to have around this area and the elementary schools around it. We know that there's some capacity around there. But we want to make sure that any decision that we make that is going to be the right longer term decision. And so as we continue to work with that, the Ashford Park, again, we've talked a lot about, this is, but much like a lot of sites out there, Ashford Park's a unique kind of situation in that it's not a small school. It's almost 800 enrollment. And the utilization is, well, it's overutilized, but it's just it's a small school on a challenging site. And so, what do we have to do to work with that community to do the due diligence for that school in particular? But it's the due diligence we need to do with every school and every decision we make. John Lewis, Montclair, and Woodward are proposed to convert a pre-K-8 feeding in the Cross Keys. Again, concerns about, is there a middle school feeder, and how do we do a middle school feeder into this area? And so in the case, though, Montclair and Woodward would need capacity expansions. So again, when you're talking about those capacity expansions, we're probably talking about more midterm kind of decision making. And so investments have to be made in an ESPLOS program. So you could be talking 3 to 5 years before things like this can happen. In the Lakeside, Druid Hills, and Tucker and Clarkson. Again, Clarkson's proposed for capacity expansion here to add a middle school to the site. Similar to the Sequoia campus, again, a lot of work was put into this idea about how you can combine a campus for middle school and high school. And there's also a proposed capital improvement project for Clarkson High School in the next ESPLOS to be identified there. The Druid Hill High School is already identified as a capital program. That was kind of mandated in this, and so as part of the plan that we consider here now. Freedom Middle School in this case would become available for a special school in the need of more of an adequate facility. And then again, we talk about some of the program buildings out there like a Kittredge, Magnet, or DAA or DSA. And one of the things we've heard in the round of feedback is that, what about these schools? They have buildings, they have needs. And what we want to do is identify that these facilities do have needs. They have capacity needs, they have waiting lists, they have condition needs. And through a process like this, is it going to be necessary to show investment into those buildings, or are there potential buildings that we could use as a result of this process that would continue the program and maintain the program just in a more suitable facility? And so you're going to see some of those throughout some of these changes. But the goal here is not a program disruption. The goal really is to identify that even those schools out there that students choose into have facility needs, and we want to address those because they're part of our district. Then we want to make sure that those students are taken care of in a facilities needs, much like the neighborhood schools. The Southwest area, McNair and Cedar Grove, Columbia Towers, and Southwest DeKalb, we'll be having this conversation on Monday night, and again, proposing McNair as a 612 high school. in this case, where early learning at Terry Mill is proposed to move to the McNair DLA. Well, you got Cedar Grove and middle school and high school were both proposed to close in round one, but are now proposed to remain open. This effectively creates a 612 campus at Cedar Grove. Again, one of the things when we talk about these 612 campuses is that we're continuing to do our due diligence on looking at these buildings to look at clear separation standards and where can we use spaces of collaboration that still separate kids, but use the buildings more efficiently, use resources more efficiently. Some advantages you have of middle schools and high schools on the same site, especially when there are lower enrollments and you can't fully staff and resource these things, are you can use middle school and high school like in AP courses where the maths and sciences are pushing down into middle school, or CTAE is pushing down into middle school. Can you use these resources collaboratively to make sure that students are finding the best experience and the teachers are finding the best experiences that they can be teaching kids through their academic career? And so there's some work to do on that, if a 612 is a way to go. But we are definitely looking at those buildings to see the capability of those buildings and what kind of investments would be made if we were to go in that direction. And Oakview Elementary proposed to close or be repurposed new for round two. Bob Mathis was proposed to be closed or repurposed in round one. The round two proposal is to convert Bob Mathis to an ELC, similar to Coralwood in this. And then once again, Wadsworth Magnet identified as a building that has facility needs and then program that has facility needs. And so again, we just want to identify that. In the southeast, in Miller Grove and Lithonia and MLK, Stoneview in the first phase, in the first iteration, was proposed to be closed and moved into the Lithonia Middle School. Now, Stoneview had had some discussions prior to this process that talked about investment into Stoneview. And so in order to maintain that continuity of the pre-discussion that happened as we walked in, keeping Stoneview open and remain as a pre-K5. Lithonia Middle School and Lithonia High School are proposed to remain as 6-8 and 9-12 respectively. This is a change from the first iteration. To address low enrollment at the surrounding middle and high schools, though, Redan, Miller Grove, and MLK are proposed to go to 612 campuses. Now, we got a lot of feedback on this week, and we appreciate that feedback about some concerns about, can these buildings really handle this? Is this the right grade configuration for this? And I want you to know that those have been heard. But in this area, we're dealing with a lot of between these three schools, and if you kind of throw in Miller Grove into this one, and Lithonia and MLK, and we're talking about almost 2,000 empty seats among the schools. And Lithonia is full. It's a smaller high school. It was designed smaller, but there's a lot of empty seats among the surrounding high schools. And so, how do we address that underutilization, but not overtax these buildings with too much enrollment and balance that better? I think there's a lot of discussion to have in this, and but it's a balance of trying to keep the ask of, can you keep all high school clusters open, or what do you have to do if you do that? And the fact of the matter is that there has to be some give and take there. That many stretching of resources across those buildings does impact programs. And so we just have to have, again, we just want to be more laser focused on having discussions with those schools to make sure we're coming up with the right solutions for those. Again, this makes Salem Middle School and Redan are available. Middle school are available for programs that may need a more adequate facility. In this case, where Farrington is proposed to close, it's a new change from round one. Again, when we're looking at the overall capacity of the 4 or 5 elementary schools around this, we find really some low utilization, a lot of empty seats, and how do we balance that better to make sure that, again, we're getting these schools fully staffed to where they need to be and not stretching those resources across. But also in this, Rock Chapel is proposed to remain open, and that is a change from the scenario one where we had proposed for a repurpose of that building. In the Stone Mountain, Redan, and Stevenson clusters, again, reiterating, Redan proposed to be a 612. We got a lot of feedback from the Redan community. We appreciate that, and we are listening to that. We do recognize the fact that Redan High School, first of all, would be a challenge in the 6-12 separation. That would take investment to do it if that were a pathway to go. But I think people are also concerned when you look at these larger grade spans about cognitive development and emotional development and different ages on a school site. When you're going from 12 to 18 or 19. Those are concerns that we hear. And so I want you to know they are being heard, but we're still working through this balance of, how do we best utilize these facilities? And because the other side of this is that we hear that, well, we don't have the depth of, program offerings that other schools might have in other parts of the district. But that comes with a balance of enrollment also. And so we have to get the enrollment to ensure some more equity in the program delivery and offerings that we have. And again, as you stretch those a little bit, but how do we balance the two to make sure that we're making the right decisions on that? Rock Chapel, again, proposed to stay open. And Elizabeth Andrews and DECA, again, have been identified as facilities that have needs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over, I think, back to Dr. Campbell to take questions for this, and hopefully we're able to answer some of those during the presentation. Thank you for your time on listening to this.
Thank you so much, Tracy. So we'll go ahead and dive into the questions. So the first question is, why is round 2 survey responses, why are they due the week of spring break? And the suggestion is that this is delayed until after spring break.
Okay.
And that sounds like a great suggestion.
Yeah, I think it's a great suggestion. Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's a great suggestion. I think between the rounds here, we're going to, there's a lot to go through. And I think between the first 2 iterations, I think that, we got some community feedback about, boy, it's kind of a quick turnaround. Did you really be able to go deeper? And I think we want to make sure that before we come out with round 3, that we've really gone into these communities a little deeper before we go back out as a whole. And so we will definitely take that into consideration. So I sure do appreciate that.
All right. The next question is about the setup in the round 2 scenario feedback session. So why was the general public split up into small groups in the public meetings? I can actually take that. So the purpose of the round 2 feedback was to really get the community in and interacting with the scenarios, to be able to come up with some proposals to really provide some solid feedback for round 3. So that was the purpose. The next question is about the estimated cost to change a 500-seat school to a 600, 800, and 950-seat school.
Again, a great question. I think that, part of that, the due diligence of looking at some sites for expansion, I think that what we don't want to do is we don't want to make a mistake of just tacking on classrooms and then leaving cafeterias the same size where it jeopardizes some of that or don't have enough support space in the building. And so it will vary by building, just so you, and so I'm afraid I'm not going to give you a great answer for specifics, but what I'll tell you that, sometimes it's a matter of, we look at a building that has a 500 capacity and we say, well, that cafeteria is situated, so we can't really expand the cafeteria to add the additional students. So do we build a new cafeteria and do conversion of space? That way we can make sure that we have the right support spaces in a building. So it will vary. And we want to make sure that, and again, we have to look at the site to make sure that, are we impacting the playgrounds? Are we impacting the circulation for, parent drop-off, bus drop-off, walkability, the ingress and egress of the site? So it will vary. And I will tell you that I do know that the investment, the overall dollar investment, certainly is smaller than just building all just new 900 student station buildings. And so where we can find those efficiencies of adding some, effective classroom additions that allow for expansion, but don't jeopardize the support spaces that, so our kids aren't eating lunch from, 10 o'clock until 1 o'clock because there's not enough cafeteria space. So we want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence on each site that we look at capacity expansion.
Thanks, Tracy. The next stakeholder seems to have some questions about some errors that were in some reported data. and they were asking about the potential for providing full reports behind the actual data utilized to make some of the recommendations.
I can take that one, Tracy. If you look on the SAP website, there is a full state of the schools report that kind of goes into the methodology with the enrollment projection data. And it does show on the dashboard, it does show full data that we can drill down by school. I would also add that this is the enrollment projection data is something that we'll be updating this summer. We did replace we did the projections based on 24-25 as the last year. We inserted the actuals for 25-26, but we will have a whole new forecast that we will generate this summer.
All right, thank you, Scott. The next question asks about specific to the South Side, that enrollment and utilization seems to be specific to the South. Why are we not going into the communities and figuring out what these communities need, and specifically looking at special programming like STEM and DLI to draw students back into the buildings? I'll actually take that question. The programming aspect of this effort is coming later on, and we are very excited about collaborating with the community in looking at what would excite the community going forward, that also partnering with our educators to see what would most effectively meet our needs in all of our different communities. All right, the next question is around the district standard of 900 is pre-COVID and outdated. These large schools are actually underutilized relative to the smaller schools. So why are we still talking about 900?
I can talk about that a little bit. The school standards that we set, this was actually from 15 years ago. This was established in the major planning process. We have one about every 5 years. And it was 2010-11 that in collaboration with the community at the time, the district kind of came to the standard of 900 for elementary, 1200 for middle, and 1600 for high. Now that isn't a one size fits all, of course, but in general, we try to stick to that unless there's a reason to vary significantly from that. We have built larger elementary schools when necessary. We've gone off that a bit for middle schools when necessary, but in general, when we're looking to build new schools, that's kind of what we're aiming at, unless there's a reason to change. What we've seen is the underutilization but the utilization at a school has more to do with the surrounding community and how our capacity and where the students are fit together. We've seen that regardless of school size. We've seen that at schools that are very small. We've seen that at schools that are very large. It's really more about how does our available capacity in an area match with the number of students. So we haven't really seen a correlation between large schools and underutilization.
All right, thank you, Hans. Next question, when will transportation analyses be completed for proposed schools for expansion?
I can address that one as well, because it's a standard practice as part of any major capital project that we do, especially any sort of expansion of capacity, to do a traffic study. So as those projects are being spun up and planned, like once they're approved to exist, and as we're planning for these projects, designing what that projects will look like, that's when we do the major traffic studies. Sometimes we might do something before everything gets going, especially if there's major questions about where exactly things happen. Right now, kind of as Tracy mentioned earlier, we're still exploring many possibilities across the district. So we would have to do traffic studies at all of our schools simultaneously in order to get that information now, and that's just not practical. But as we continue on, as we identify where are some of these areas where we would want to expand capacity, and then capacity expansion projects take a long time, first to just get off the ground, then to design, and then to actually construct and complete. So during that process, there will absolutely be traffic studies to say, here's the expected impact, and here's mitigation efforts as part of that project.
Alrighty, thank you, Hans. The next question is about just additional data. Do we have any plans, or why have we not yet put out full data projections showing the effect of closing school A versus school B on a 5 to 10 year timeline? I'm gonna toss that at you, Tracy.
and I heard the question, but can you can say it one more time? I just want to make sure I followed it. And I apologize for that.
Sure. So the stakeholders looking for more details around what would be the impact of closing school A versus, school B. So how are we coming up with scenario one versus scenario two? And can they get more data on like a 5 to 10 year timeline of what that impact would be?
Okay, so I think that, as we go again further into this a little bit, I think that narrowing down to these more near term, middle term, and longer term scenarios is part of, as we get this feedback and get more specific to this, I think when we're going to see in the next iteration is how we identify that better. And admittedly, we need to do that better about identifying some of that. I also know that as we look at the utilization and the school size of a surrounding area, what Hans just mentioned is that, sometimes it's not just one specific school, it's accumulation of, 3 or 4 or 5 schools that are in a cluster that, that students are in proximity to other school buildings. And what does that mean? On the fact sheet, we do have information on financial impacts of school consolidation and closure and what it means to the operations of it. I think a big question we get asked in this, and likely will get asked as a follow-up to this one, is that, well, if you're going to spend money to build, are you really saving any dollars? Well, first of all, there's 2 separate pots of money here. You've got the capital dollars that go to school improvement and from a facility standpoint, and then you got the operations. The capital dollars are a one-time spend. Operations is perpetual. So spending money at a building to operate a building is perpetual for the lifetime of the building. And so when we look at, some cost efficiencies, and again, this isn't necessarily just about financial, even though sometimes it comes across as that. But when the finances aren't there, then the education can't happen either. So they have to be tied together in some level. Those financial impacts of operational savings allow us to use our dollars deeper and not wider. So as we get through the next iteration, we're going to start to show kind of what the impact of movement of students does and what it would take to invest into the facilities that are receiving them. And, and again, we still have a boundary process that we have to pay attention to. I think that it's not just movement of students from that perspective, but it's also going to be looking at, how does it impact boundaries, and can we move entire boundaries together, or are we going to have to shift some boundaries around? Again, one of the big focuses of the first feedback was, how do you keep continuity in the high school cluster? And so our boundary discussion has to balance both the utilization of elementary and middle schools to keep them in the same cluster. And so those are answers as we walk through a process, and again, as we plan in public, that you'll see as we go and iteratively through this. And what I mean step by step through this is you'll start to see the impacts of those things. But we have done the analysis on, cost avoidance and cost and cost savings, operational costs. They're not savings because we're just going to redistribute dollars, of what it means when we do make moves like that. And that's in the fact sheet.
All right, thanks, Tracy. So the next question asks, will we have a committee for planning programming by cluster for round 3? And it talks about, literacy issues and the potential for magnets. So I think the real question is, when does programming come into play? I can definitely guarantee that the community will be involved when we start to talk about programming. But what does this each round kind of look like, Tracy?
So I think that, and again, when we talk, and I think this is something that on our side that we really do have to be clear on, and that we're not like when we say it's facilities, then program, then boundaries, like it's not that we're ignoring the programs. Like we're understanding that we see and programs top down all the way from, core and academic delivery to special education to special courses, fine arts, all those things. Those are part of our discussions. And if this scenario arises out of this building, what programs are in that building, or what are we going to have to anticipate as we look at implementation? So are there units for exceptional student education that will be impacted by this, and what does it mean to when they go to middle school or high school? So we do think about that in the background and talk about that in our scenario development. However, when you start to talk about really this program placement and how facilities impact that, I will leave it to the academic group on this call from the district level to talk about how they engage community in this, because we work side by side. I know that Hans's group as a planning group has worked side by side by academics for years to help kind of guide this too. So I will kind of lean on even Hans, because he's been part of this, or the academic team, to talk about the community engagement piece of it. But I don't want you to think that we're ignoring the programs in here. That part of what we think about when we're thinking about implementation is what's it going to take to really maintain the continuity of programs. Whether, again, they can go from anything from DLI to exceptional student education to fine arts programs that kind of feed through, or all those things that have to be kind of mixed into this. And so anyway, Hans, I'll turn it over to you about the community portion and how do we do that.
Absolutely. And as Dr. Campbell said, like the programs have always been considered to be part of this SAP process. We've been, especially in the first two rounds, a lot more focused on buildings, recognizing that to have a true conversation about not just what programs we have, but where are they, requires you to have a better understanding of like what is the facility inventory, the inventory of schools that are going to be available to house these programs. And then we can talk about where best to put different programs to best serve the needs of the district. And as part of that would be, well, what programs could be, I should say, I don't know, but could be a conversation about, well, what programs are necessary, either existing or new. But at the same time, while we've focused more on buildings and we're saying, okay, programs and redistricting will absolutely happen, but that's more of a next fall conversation. As Tracy just said, we in the background know that these things can't truly fully be separated into different separate chunks. We can begin talking about buildings, but we're not going to be able to really wrap up that conversation without beginning to bring in conversations around programs and even a little bit of redistricting. And so you can see even in round two, there's a little bit of nod towards what potential redistricting may look like, or what are part of what that conversation, like what schools would be involved in that conversation for given potential proposals. Schools that are school choice schools right now are identified as potentially either being schools being available for programs, or existing programs in schools right now that may need a new facility. And that's to the beginning of, we expect round by round to that to be more and more until at least definitely this fall, potentially even sooner, but definitely this fall will be a direct addressing of, okay, we need to talk about programs because we can't bring this conversation any farther without directly saying, where are our programs going to be? What programs are we going to have? Where are they going to be? And there's a certain amount of conversation about especially what programs we're going to have that we're not going to be able to resolve immediately. That will be an ongoing long-term conversation for this district. And especially as we're talking about beginning implementation of whatever comes out of this process, the goal isn't to provide immediate shocks to folks. So we're not looking to shut down everything right away or anything. It's a question of, right now, it's a focus of what is where? Where do we have our buildings? What schools? What's our inventory? And then where do the programs fit within that? And then what are the boundaries of the neighborhood schools that are within that inventory? So that's how we're approaching that. So it's a long answer, but it really comes to more programs are going to become more and more a part of this as we go along.
Thanks, Hans. And I'll actually do a mini toss to Dr. Prejean Harris to see if she has anything to add just about, in general, how do we approach collaborating with community on when we're making shifts in curriculum or programming or things of that sort. Oh, I'm not sure Dr. Prejean Harris was able to join us. All right, so we will go on to the next question, and maybe we'll loop back there. The next question is about these grade level band configurations. We've talked about a few different configurations, whether that's K-8 or 612. What data or research are we using to make those types of recommendations?
So again, we do look at research, and I think that, again, research can direct you a lot of times in the way that you want to direct you. I mean, you can I could probably cite, or find, 100 articles on why K-8 is the best, and then I can find another 100 articles on why middle schools can offer the best opportunities for students, pure middle schools and not in a middle school in 6-8. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that the grade configurations, if a grade configuration decision is made, first of all, that the grade configuration isn't just a utilization fix. It has to be intentional toward the success of students. And so, where grade configuration does come into play is that there's, a lot of research on building transition and regression in learning when students, there's always, so in education, there's always regression of students when they go from grade to grade. So there's always, they get done with their summer break and they fall back a little bit and then they catch up a little bit, and or they catch up and exceed. And so that's been part of education for a long time. But research has really stated that when students make a grade transition and a building transition, that regression actually goes deeper. So it takes a little longer to recover from the regression. And so that's why sometimes we see where K-8s can be beneficial in a community where you're not really changing buildings. And so the impact is less on students. But then the other argument to that is that the people make the argument that 6-year-olds shouldn't be in a building with a 13-year-old. And so again, the research will take you in the way it will take you. We're more focused on the idea is a grade configuration the right fit for a community? And are the buildings appropriate for a grade configuration for that? Again, in the 6-12 conversation, we've talked about some blended resourcing, but we've really talked about how to operate buildings as a middle school and a high school and a campus. And then being able to share some resources, not share students across the board. But what that allows for in a campus like that is it really allows for true objective-based learning. That students aren't, confined to a grade level, they're confined to their ability to learn. And so I think that offers a lot of opportunities for students when you have a wider grade band in there. And so there's a lot of, I know that's a long answer to it, but there's a lot of research on a lot of different grade configurations. I will, admittedly, I'm going to tell you there's not a lot on 6-12 because the predominant kind of grade configuration when you get to that middle high school is a 7-12. And again, the research in that shows really the impact in 8th grade in those grade configurations. And when you see research like that, I think what we want to do is when you see that the research points you in a direction that says this is where it has its issues. Like for instance, in 7-12, the research shows about 8th grade testing scores and those things like that. So if a decision for a 7-12, and again, hypothetically, I want to make sure this is hypothetically goes, and the research tells you that 8th grade test scores struggle in this, then the district should have a responsibility to resource and staff to get in front of what the research is telling you are negative impacts of a grade configuration. And so, 75%, between 75 and 80% of districts across the country are standard like K-5, 6, 8, 9, 12. But across the country, we see declining enrollment at 6th grade because of middle school education and people going into a full-fledged middle school and understanding that there's challenges at the middle grades. So we see, a lot of districts, I mean, almost most districts that we work with see either a stagnant or a drop in 6th grade enrollment to go into full-fledged middle schools. Does that tell you middle schools are bad? No, not necessarily. But it tells you that that there's some perception around grade configuration that clouds research. Again, I think ultimately what I want to get back to is, and bring this to close, is that if a grade configuration is the right solution, the right solution would be to fit the community that it's in. We do not want to create so many grade configurations across the district where it becomes a spaghetti maze of trying to figure out pathways. We want to make sure that they stand within a proven research method for the community that it fits.
All right, thanks, Tracy. So the next question is about data validity again, but it takes a kind of a different approach. So I'm going to toss it to Hans. And the question is, how does the district verify the data that's used in the construction of the scenarios?
Sure. So there's a couple different ways, and usually this question is around enrollment. That's the number one question we get. So I'm going to answer it specifically from enrollment. For capacity, we have standard capacities we've used for 5 years. We construct our capacities in much the same way as the state of Georgia. They're slightly different, but they're very similar methodology. For enrollment, we use the same base enrollment data from year to year that we send to the state. Our numbers are slightly different than theirs because of exactly how the state counts a full-time student versus how we count, exactly what time of day it's always taken on the same day, but there's a few slight variations, but for the most part, it's the same data on the same student population. So the real question is about methodology. How do you take that data and say, here's what we've had up until now, what do we expect for the future? We'd use industry standard formats. This is also what HPM did. They have their own independent forecast that they have done. We do our independent forecast. That's why some folks have seen the fact that in planning for next year, principals have a slightly different number than what is currently in the HPM's forecast. That's because we independently do forecasts and talk to each other and validate to make sure that each forecast is the best for what it needs to be. Ours is calibrated for a next year planning for school opening. HPM's is calibrated for a long-term planning process. And as Scott said, that's going to be redone to make sure that as we move forward with this process, it's based on the most up-to-date data. Both of our forecasts use industry standard survival cohort methodology, also looking at housing, birth rates, and really as much data as we can possibly pull in. We talk with refugee agencies, we talk with developers who haven't even begun to break ground or even purchase property. We talk with cities, we talk with county, everyone we possibly can to get an idea of, on top of the underlying rates of change that we see in student populations, what's coming up. So and on top of that, I would say for this district especially, because we do our own forecasting, we on a regular basis bring in outside groups to validate our methodology, to take a look at our forecast and see is there anything that we can do to improve it, to make sure that we're making the best forecasts we can. And because what we always say in forecasting is the goal of forecasting isn't to be right. No forecast can be perfectly right. It's to be less wrong than any other forecast. And that's our goal.
All right, thanks for that, Hans. The next question says, in the scenarios, it appears as if you're talking about sending kids to different schools for a period and then making adjustments to grade bands as other schools are built, which could be dependent upon funding, etc. Can someone speak to this? I'm going to toss that to you, Tracy.
I can answer this one, Tracy.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this one is alluding, I think, specifically to a certain school. We're trying to look at in that scenario. I'll just say it's Ashford Park. We're trying to find ways to accommodate students in the near term with existing capacity. That would be the reason for like a temporary grade band solution until we can have more permanent capacity come online. If that's not something that you're open to, give us that feedback. Hans, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah.
Ashford Park especially we've even talked about it in a unique situation where it is large, as Tracy has even said, it's not a small school, it's a small building, a large school in a small building. And so trying to find the solutions for that community, as we've said, every community is different, and we need to be sensitive to that as part of this process. And for that community, we need different kinds of solutions than we will in other areas, other clusters in this county. And so that's something that we wanted to make sure we asked about, because kind of as Scott said, we need to hear from the community. We need to have that conversation, say things that may or may not work, hear the feedback so that we can figure out like what's the best way to move forward as we are figuring out how to implement whatever comes out of this process.
All right, thank you, team. So the next question talks a bit about, what's behind kind of the black box behind the arrows that are on the charts, right? What data is considered as you're building a scenario beyond, just drawing lines between schools as we look at capital costs, transportation costs, and other feasibility. So how do we know that these scenarios are actually realistic?
Okay, so with those lines on the map, they are lines drawn on the map. We have kind of looked kind of at the cluster level, like, do we have enough capacity in the cluster to make this happen, to kind of determine those lines? But those lines are not a guarantee of assignment. It's just kind of area, schools that may be in play as we get towards that boundary process. As we continue to move forward, we'll continue to have more detail and clarity. There's a lot of questions about, well, why aren't we going to have actual budgets and numbers of students and utilization? We really need to know the boundaries to figure out exactly what those are. And so again, this is kind of that iterative process where we're planning in public. We'll continue to gain clarity and focus as we move forward.
Yeah, and I'll add on to what Scott was saying, where one of the big things we heard in round one was a real sense of confusion around if something happens at my school, whatever it is, what's going to happen with my student, which is what this whole process is about. And one of the ways that we thought might be able to help begin to answer that, even though, again, until we really get to the end and talk about programs and boundaries, especially, there's a lot of answers that we can't be 100% on until we have those data. But we thought what might help kind of begin to answer that and respond to that worry from round one is to say, okay, if a school is consolidating or moving or changing, like, here's what schools may be in play when redistricting does happen. As Scott said, it wasn't intended as this is what will happen. It's here's something to think about. If you live in school A, here's the 2 or 3 closest schools that are likely to be in play for if school A is going to consolidate. That will obviously change as scenarios change moving forward, but also as programs and especially boundaries become more part of the conversation, that's when you'll stop seeing arrows being like, hey, you could go one of several different ways to, okay, here's what we're actually talking about. And we'll make sure that's very clearly communicated as we move forward, because there has been confusion about that, and we want to make sure that we reduce that confusion moving forward.
Dr. Campbell, can I just, and I know piling on is not always the best kind of approach to this, but I do think what has to be addressed here is that, like, I think what happens in a facilities plan, especially of this magnitude, is that there can creep in a perception that the facilities plan will fix everything. It'll fix that, low literacy, it'll fix program, and all that. But the facilities are one resource and one tool of teaching and learning. And it is an important tool. There's no question. They shape communities, they shape how things are done. When those facilities start to get in the way of teaching and learning and all those kind of things is when we have to look at facilities as one of the tools in the tool belt that has to be modified to make sure that we can fit. And so when we have buildings that are too small to handle the capacity of a building, it hinders the educational delivery of the day. When we have too many buildings across, and which means we have to have, again, I keep talking about stretching resources. The resources go to when, I have to have 15 extra buses because I have to go to 15 extra sites. And then the other side of the complaint is that we can't find school bus drivers or our transportation's late, but we still want to keep all the buildings open and stretch all those buses across. And so a facilities plan isn't kind of the magic button that fixes everything, but what it does is it allows us to build an infrastructure to support the educational mission. And so when we can create buildings that have enough enrollment in them and provide the right building for the capacity or the enrollment of the students, when we don't stretch our resources across everywhere from the support services that get our kids to schools and feed our kids and provide social services for our kids, when we can staff those buildings and our buildings are appropriate for staffing, then we can start to work towards improvement. But it also goes to the idea that when that happens, there's other implications, like hiring of good leadership and maintaining good teachers in the buildings and maintaining longevity of good teachers, which is becoming more and more of a struggle just to hire teachers and hire staff into schools because we're just not finding the pool out there. And so this whole idea that that buildings will fix everything, or when you do this, buildings will ruin everything is a misperception, because there's so many factors that can do that. What we're trying to do is position the infrastructure to support that. And I think that is part of the data that goes behind this, is that when we're not doing that to the best of the ability to support the educational mission, that's when facilities need to get addressed.
Thank you, Tracy. I seem to be getting quite a few comments as opposed to questions in the Q&A. So just wanted to remind folks that, you're coming up with great suggestions, great commentary. You can definitely submit through the survey link that's on the SAP website. And just want to make sure you don't feel like your questions are being ignored, but for things that are comments and suggestions, those will go through the SAP survey. The next question, how many empty seats would we have if scenario 2 was implemented? I'm going to toss that at you.
Scott, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm getting there. It is less than scenario 1, but we will have to calculate that. I mean, we haven't calculated. I just need to look it up and we'll post that in the FAQ.
Yeah, and that's not to say we don't have a number. It's more like in going from scenario 1 to scenario 2. Like for scenario 1, we did have an exact number. For scenario 2, we focused more on let's explore different options for different areas with less of an emphasis on finding an exact number that perfectly answered all the questions. So we have a general idea. That's what Scott's going to get and make sure it's posted. It'll be in the same ballpark as scenario 1, just slightly less. We just don't want to put an exact number out there and be wrong. So he'll get that.
Yep.
But as we said, in general, what we're now looking at is trying to explore different options in different areas to make sure that, before we start to go even deeper into boundaries and programs, let's figure out what works. Let's talk to the communities, get better, more specific feedback on different possibilities and options so that as we go deeper and we begin to say, okay, here is our, numbers and, more fleshed out scenarios, that's based on feedback and not just, what kind of came initially out of round 1.
All right. Thank you, Hans. This question is about funding, and I know we don't have anybody from finance on here, so maybe someone could answer it. Where's the funding coming from? Just in general for any of these changes.
I can begin to answer that. So changes, especially changes to facilities, the number one funding source for we call it capital projects or capital improvements. If we're talking about either an addition or a new school or even a major renovation, the number one funding source is SPLOST. We have our own local capital project fund. But in general, as kind of Tracy mentioned before, there is a pool of money for capital improvements, for improving the condition and the size of schools that is specific to capital. We can't cross between funding for instruction and funding for these capital improvements. So that's part of this is before we look at how does this district want to invest those dollars moving forward, we need to know what is the long-term plan for our facility. How do we make sure we are investing in the facilities not just that have the highest need, that has the needs of the facilities, we've done that analysis, we've looked at it, but also how do we plan to use all of our facilities to make sure that our improvements match up with those uses and those needs moving forward.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Hans. The next question, I'm actually going to toss it to Mr. Kennedy in HR. With bigger schools being proposed. Oh, the question just hopped away. Uh-oh. I think the question might have disappeared, but the question was just about as we look at bigger schools, how is that impacting class sizes?
Well, that again, I think just to clarify, that school size and class size aren't correlated, that a building with the right capacity will hold the students it will hold at the mandated class size by the district. Oftentimes class size is impacted by operational cost mandated by board policy and funding. Or what we find is that oftentimes in really smaller schools, like really small schools, is that we can find actually that class size increases at the smaller schools because you get another 1, 2, or 3 students in a classroom. You don't have enough dollars or FTEs to constitute another teacher. And so what you do is you kind of load up before you can get the threshold of the next teacher. And so we actually find the opposite impact. Again, the intent of trying to balance the size of school is that is to make sure that class sizes are maintained under board policy for class size. But what starts to happen, and then again, you can point out many school districts across the country that when cost savings starts to come into play, and districts are looking at cost savings, one of the first things to go is transportation. The second thing to go is staffing, because staffing is typically 85 to 89% of a district's budget. And so there's no correlation between the two, but there is causation when school size causes it to be. So, and for instance, when a building is too small and you get overutilized because of resistance to boundary changes or leveling out of enrollment, then a building and the boundary can cause that to happen. And so if a building's too small and the boundary is too big, and there's resistance to change the boundary, or we don't have the dollars to make additions onto a building, then class size can be impacted, certainly.
All right, thanks, Tracy. The next question is, it's specific to the Lakeside cluster. So the stakeholder feels like none of the feedback from scenario 1 to scenario 2 was considered. So can you speak to what's the difference between scenario 1 and 2 with respect to any schools in the Lakeside cluster?
Sure, I'll take this one. When we look at the feedback, again, it is one piece of, one facet of this process. We also have to consider the data. We did propose some alternative ideas for that cluster, but I would continue to share your feedback. Just specifically with Lakeside, the issue is, the schools are well utilized, and we acknowledge that. They're just too small from a capacity standpoint. And so, I would continue to share the feedback that you've been sharing. We've been hearing a lot from Oak Grove and some of the other schools that are in that area. And, we're looking at making some adjustments in scenario 3.
Thank you, Scott. The next question is about the psychological impacts of these questions. So this is coming to Dr. Norris Brown. So what are we doing to address some of those social emotional impacts of potential changes?
I can begin to answer that, although there's a lot of specifics that elsewhere, especially a curriculum and wraparound services helps with this quite a bit. But changes in a school district are common. This district has done redistricting before, has done large redistrictings before, and in the not too distant past, we've done in particular areas redistrictings. And the idea of students needing to move from one school to another, from one school year to the next, is common enough that this is an issue that we have resources for, we have an understanding of. Now, that's not to say that this might be at a scale that we haven't done for a very long time. And absolutely, there are conversations within the district about making sure that, how do we ensure that we provide the resources for our students and especially for our staff to make sure that these transitions, when they happen in as smooth and as best a way as possible. One of those ways is, as I mentioned before, implementation. This is a long-term plan. Not all of this will happen at the same time. And so we can spread out when things will happen, where they will happen, so that resources can be available for staff, for students, when transitions are happening. So again, I don't have all of the specifics with that. And I think that's something that we do want to make sure is communicated, especially as we get into the redistricting and talking about what some of the short-term changes will end up being, because nothing is going to happen for fall of 26. Nothing is happening next fall. But beginning fall of 27, that's when whatever comes out of this will begin to be implemented. And we want to make sure that folks understand, here are the resources, here's what this district is doing to make those changes and those transitions as easy as we can.
Thanks, Hans. The next question is about, will the district actually come out to communities to see what's actually needed in a lower income community, and so that folks have opportunities to express their concerns? So I can speak to that. We're coming out to all communities And we've been engaging with all communities through our outreach efforts this week, and in many cases on some smaller scale levels. And we are very excited with collaborating with all communities on continuing the conversation.
And
Um,
just to
Go
give
ahead.
more context to that too, uh, we are still towards the beginning of this conversation, and a constant theme of everything that we've been talking about on the district side is how do we make sure as we go along that we reach out to these communities that need more conversation. Yes, we want to engage with all communities, but we also recognize that some communities either we haven't heard from and we need to reach out to them to make sure that they are heard, or are maybe seeing more of an impact than other communities, and we need to make sure that we are sensitive to that and reach out to those. That these efforts will continue and even maybe even grow more intense as we go along.
Alrighty. This question kind of looks to the future. Is it possible for any of the school grounds to become dual use going forward?
Yeah, I think that one of the, when you're in a plan like this, and I know the district has some existing property also, is to think about repurpose and think about, what is the long-term goal of a site? I think, the district has a vested interest in holding on to property. There's no question. What if you learn one thing about a district like DeKalb is the evolving changes that happen over 20 and 30 and 40-year periods in a district like this and the movement that happens. And so site preservation is a big deal. But how do you use these facilities and what are the community needs? I think it's a part of a discussion that if a building does become available, what is the best and most appropriate use of that facility for the community, for the school district, and how you do that. I think that as again we start into these phases as we start to narrow down. You've seen we've identified some buildings for early learning childhood centers. We know there's a need across the district for these. More opportunity for that. I think Dr. Sauce has alluded to DeKalb being the highest provider of early childhood services in the state of Georgia. That's something that DeKalb works toward. And so how do you support that service? But we also know that there are social and community needs out there that these buildings can be used for. And look, in some cases, and again, you can't point out specific ones where maybe a building isn't the most appropriate use of that site right now because of its condition or whatever. And maybe it's just a good spot for green space right now, but the district holds on to it and works with the community about how to use it as green space in the community. And so those are options out there that we certainly want to explore. But I also think that's a community conversation. I don't think it's a mandate to a community that we're going to use the building for this without a conversation with the community.
Thanks, Tracy. Is school performance going to be considered in any of the scenarios?
Well, again, we've addressed the school performance issue quite a bit through this, and I think that when you start to look at school performance, there's a lot of different layers to school performance as we go through this. And school performance can be a slippery slope. And I've used the example a lot about, in a district I worked with, probably it's now about 10 or 12 years ago, that we had a smaller school that was performing very well and had capacity at a school literally a mile away, but because it was performing well, and then 3 years later, the school was 3 grades lower because of change of administration that led to some program differences at it. And so all of a sudden you can close the school. I don't know if that's the right mandate across the board. Also, different challenges at different buildings impact performance. And when you're looking at impacts on districts on performance and standards like that, the things that come into play a lot are things like socioeconomic and family structure and direct instruction and program availability. And so there's a lot of influence. And on top of that, then how do you start to measure performance? Because there are schools that might not have the same, let's say, grade level performance, but are making more gains. And so do you hold on to buildings that are having more gains in their performance than that buildings that may be performing well but aren't having the gains and continuous gains? And so there's a lot of differentiation on what performance means. Now, that being said, we do pay attention to performance, and the idea that maintaining good performing schools is important to the district. Obviously, this district has, and again, there's, when you look at districts this large, there's always some perception out there that that they're not great performing districts, but DeKalb is a great performing district across the board. And so we know that there's schools that have challenges, that are facing some academic challenges, but we're trying to address that by supporting them more from available resources in those facilities. So again, we do pay attention, but performance is a slippery slope sometimes.
All right. The next question is about, we've spoken about cost avoidance. What's the plan for sharing cost avoidance data?
Okay, so some of it's already in the facts that you can see, what it costs to operate a school. But when we also talk about cost avoidance, we look at like condition cost avoidance, that we know when students are in a building, the condition of that facility from a component standpoint of priorities changes from if the building changes to something like a district use. And so one of the things is that when cost avoidance, when you're looking at like an eSPLOS program, like there's so many needs out there across so many buildings. How do you direct those dollars so they're maximized? Look, we know that, whatever the eSPLOS number is, 7, 8, or $900 million, that's a big number. But when one high school can cost 200 million, or you're spending 70 million on elementary schools today, 900 million, and it's just bizarre to even say this, that 900 million doesn't even go that far across all facilities. And so cost avoidance is a little bit about redirecting the dollars to the longer term need of the district and facilities, and not investing into schools that, first of all, are necessarily undersized for the performance and grade level resources that we want to do. But they need fixed. That every building should have a minimum of being what we might call warm, safe, and dry, or cool, safe, and dry. And so the cost avoidance goes to that, is that just maintaining the cool, safe, and dry standard sometimes can be an unaffordable solution for school districts. And so we have to make sure that we're redirecting our condition dollars to the longer term goals of the district from an academic and performance standpoint on positioning the infrastructure to support the academics.
Next question, when are these changes potentially going into effect, specifically for the central zone?
I think that's a great question. I think that, and Han's going to answer this too, but I think that, again, part of this is looking at near term and middle term and long term. We know that nothing is going to happen in this next school year. It's not even possible to do that. And even in the following year, based on some of the boundary and program things that come out as we work through this process through the summer and fall with the community, that could have some impact on timing also. But again, the near-term ones that, if anything, would be done, those near-term ones would be the ones that don't require capital, significant capital investment. Again, the intent isn't to take a group of students into a building of less adequacy and condition. And so we want to make sure that the receiving schools are the appropriate spaces and condition of a facility for students to receive. So the nearer terms would be ones that don't necessarily require that. The midterms are going to take some eSPLOS investment and capital investment to ensure that students are walking into a facility that is more adequate and in better condition than the building they walked out of. So that's kind of the timing of those, but nothing happens in the next year. And oftentimes, even in these, and even when we're talking about like the small school scenario, it's going to take a longer term solution to get to some of those ideas.
Yep. And I'm going to add on to what Tracy said. Tracy's exactly right that really it's when you look at the chart, when you see short term, medium term, medium long, whatever the case is, it's really the short term ones are in probably years 1 through 3. And there'll be a lot more communication about that, especially as we move forward. It's like, what's this timeline look like? But for anything that relies on a capital project to add capacity, I mentioned before, any new capital project is something that doesn't happen quickly. It takes time to plan, it takes time to design, and then and that's all before you even begin construction, and then it takes time to construct. That's especially true for new capacity, a new addition, or a new school, but it's also true for major renovations. In round 2, we've begun to identify schools that need even just a major renovation, so that however that facility is used, that the condition of that facility needs to be improved. Now, we can't do all things all at the same time, and that's going to be part of this conversation moving forward, is kind of the timing of not just when changes to a school happen from a how we use it point of view, but then, how do we make sure that these facilities are maintained, get the renovations that they need, and are what we need them to be for our students moving forward. So all of that's to say, just what Tracy said, especially since the questions seem to come from the central area, a lot of that is going to be reliant on building new construction so that these small schools are no longer small. That's something that can't happen in the short term. It takes more time. And so at the same time, there are things in the short term, especially for whether it be changes in school use or moves or whatever the case is, and the beginnings of planning for those projects that will improve our schools all over the district, and potentially if there's a need for adding capacity, what that might look like, when that might happen.
All right. So we have time for one, maybe two more questions before we close out. What feedback will be asked of or allowed from stakeholders going forward into scenario 3? And how much time will we give stakeholders to respond?
The first, let me answer the second question first, because I do think going back to the very first question of today's discussion was, getting the feedback from this, and again, I think we do need to address the spring break issue and maybe extend it out there a little bit. So and also keep in mind that we are in continuous review of the feedback. It's not like we're just gonna it's not like we wait until it closes to see it. Like, we're compiling that data now. So as we work through this and work day to day in this, we review it. And so it's ongoing. Now, we are, I think the evaluation of kind of where the next round goes, and when it will be released is something that, we're gauging based on the feedback we have here. I think we intentionally didn't come out to say round 3 scenarios come out on April, whatever. And I think that for us, it's intentional, because knowing the amount of feedback we got in the first one and gauging the amount of feedback we're getting in this one will dictate how we move forward in the next 4 to 6 weeks, and maybe 4 to 8 weeks. But part of that also is that, making sure that we're communicating with specific communities as we go through this, before we release kind of a third round of this. The intent, much like Dr. Campbell said and Hans alluded to earlier, is that the intentionality of going into more specific communities about some more of these discussions that we hear from this feedback will be important. So I'm not going to commit to a timeline on the next scenarios, because I want to be really intentional about the response to the communities that we're hearing from in this, and doing the deeper dives that Dr. Campbell had alluded to earlier, and getting more from that before we release that next round.
All right. So our last question. So if we don't know boundaries, and I'm going to add on to this question, we, haven't decided on programming. Why can't we do all this at once?
Well, I mean, I'll let Hans answer this too, but I think from our standpoint on doing processes like this, I think that, there's still the idea that there has to be some facilities reduction here. And we can't get away from that discussion. As hard it is, look, nobody's happy about having to close buildings, and the process is hard to even talk about how we do that. But we also know that there has to be some reduction of facilities. And so without coming to some conclusion on there, how do you draw boundaries without knowing what facilities are going to exist? In the meantime, we also, again, the same in the program discussion, is that we're not ignoring the program discussion. We're not ignoring the boundary scenario, but we also know that it's a community process. So for instance, when we open Sequoia, there has to be a boundary process to that. And what will that mean to feeder patterns into those elementary boundaries to allow the feeder patterns to be correct into that building that balances the enrollment in the north part of this district? And so we know that's happening. We know there's going to be impacts on the surrounding high school clusters. And So we do consider that, and we talk about that in our scenario development. But to come out and say that we're going to do that would mean that we get the feedback, and we get a lot of feedback on, you already made that decision, so why are you coming to us? We haven't made that decision. And so I want to make sure that we're balancing the two, that we're not ignoring the two, or the three, kind of combination of the three. But at some point, you have to determine your infrastructure to determine some of these things that can happen. Again, a specific example I could give is when we talked about like the theme schools out there, the schools that are program schools, that are choice schools, that are district-wide availability for students, that they have facility needs. And whether it's a capacity or a condition, they have facility needs. They were probably wondering the same thing. Why haven't you decided what's going to happen to us? Well, because maybe that we haven't come up with a final scenario yet that gives us a really good alternative for your program. And we're not just going to dictate and mandate where you're going without some discussion about what is available out there for you. And so I think it's a balance of, again, and I know, and regardless if the term is exhaustive, but the planning in public and making this transparent in front of this is that part of this is balancing the two, or balancing the three factors here, while you're trying to get to an infrastructure discussion. And so, and last thing I'll say to this is that sometimes in this discussion that there's a question as to why that school, when it might have enough that the utilization is fine or the building is fine. Well, the discussion is that there are 5 schools around it, that it happens to be the one in the center that can support the 5 schools around it. And so how do you look at a boundary process while you're looking at the infrastructure there? Because the fact of the matter is that if I combine an elementary school cluster and look at the total capacity of that area, and I see so many empty seats, the fact of the matter, it could be any of the schools in the combination. And so getting to that discussion about what your infrastructure is going to look like to help inform the boundary, to help inform the programs also, is kind of a circular discussion. So, and so we do know that that's all part of it. Just and all that continues to be engaged in the conversation.
I'm going to add on or answer this question too in a different way than Tracy did, because that question of, why can't we just do everything all at once, rip the Band-Aid off and get it out of the way. And I think one of the reasons that we're not advocating for that, or at least we're considering it, because it is the easiest thing to do from a purely logistical numbers point of view is, yes, make all the changes at once, adjust, and then we're good for a while. But the reality is that the scale of changes that we are talking about, we recognize is enormous. And there's even a lot of changes, like because the conversation has been focused so much on buildings, there is a level of changes that are going to impact even more schools. The majority of the district, in fact, almost every school in this district is going to be touched by this process before we're done, because we still have to talk about programs and boundaries. And boundaries won't just be for these schools that are potentially changing in use or closing or whatever the case is. It's across the district, schools that are not changing how we're using them, but have an imbalance of students and are maybe 2 clusters away from schools that may be having an impact. They're still going to be considered as part of a boundary process. And so that's something that we'll be talking about more in future rounds as we bring more and more of that program and boundary discussion in. And especially as we talk more about the implementation timeline, is just a recognition that one of the reasons why we're saying this can't all happen at once, beyond even just the need for actual physical changes to happen in some cases, is the fact that there will be lots of disruption and change, even beginning in year 1, outside of even what we've been talking about here in the SAP process. And I think a great example is, and these communities are aware because we've been talking about it for a while, with Dresden Elementary opening. We're in the middle of construction of rebuilding Dresden Elementary. It'll have more capacity. Carrier Reynolds, which was moved to swing space at Nancy Creek, will be coming back, and there'll be a boundary process in that area around that. That's going to impact all of the elementary schools in that area. On top of that, Sequoia Middle and High are in the middle of construction right now, and that redistricting is going to need to happen. The new middle school will be available fall of 27. It only makes sense to redistrict the high school boundaries as well at the same time, so that when the high school comes online a little bit later, everything's already in place. And so, and at the same time, major renovation at Idlewood. There was some redistricting to take kids out of Idlewood temporarily. The redistricting will need to happen to bring them, some of them back. That's also wrapping up in time for fall of 27. And so just pre-existing, outside of what SAP is doing, pre-existing projects are going to necessitate a redistricting in the Tucker cluster, in the around Sequoia, which includes Cross Keys, Chambly, Dunwoody, and likely Lakeside as well, being right across the highway. All of these areas are very likely to see redistricting in the near future, regardless of SAP. Those redistrictings are being folded into this process, but even if SAP had never happened, we would still be needing to have these discussions as a district. And that's on top of whatever else happens as coming out of SAP, beginning implementation in year one with fall of 27. So that's just a taste of there will be lots of widespread changes. And then we will continue to adjust as we go along so that the full 10-year plan will take 10 years, and we can't do it all at once.
All right. Well, thank you so much for engaging with us this morning. Remember, please remember to submit your feedback to the SAP survey on our website. And remember that your voice matters and will inform our next steps. We're listening, refining, and shaping together. So please continue to stay engaged and have a great day, everyone.